Welcome back, my fabulous fourth grade friends. Guys, it is hard to believe, but we have just 3 modules left, including this one. Get ready to learn all about numerical reasoning standard 5. As always, I like to begin going over our math standards timeline. Just a reminder, over the next couple of years, we will be participating in professional learning with the goal of understanding these new standards. And by school year 2023, we will begin with full implementation. Before we dig into the standards, let's talk best practices. What does an effective math class look like? How does it sound? Ultimately, the goal is for students to experience the productive struggle in math. As the quote says on the screen, the only way to learn math is to do math. John Hattie has done extensive research in the field of instructional strategies. He's determined their effect size or potency on students' learning. So anything above a 0.4 effect size is going to give students at least 1 grade level of an increase. Anything above a 0.6 up to 2 grade levels of increase. So what type of effect size do our practices have? Well, even something as small as classroom discussions, for example, number talks, has the effect size of 0.82 on students' learning. That's more than 2 years of increase on students' learning if done consistently in the classroom. And if you haven't done any research into his strategies, I highly suggest going and poking around on his website. It's very interactive, and there are some things that really stood out to me, like, for example, playing music in your classroom, something that I love to do, doesn't actually have a huge effect size on kids. Doesn't mean I'm going to stop doing it, but it also has other strategies on there that I haven't thought of that I can implement in my classroom that do have a great effect size on them. All this to say, that's why collaborative math classrooms have to be our cornerstone of instruction. We want our students living in that productive struggle, discussing math, not just during number talk time, but at every step of the way. Anytime we can get them discussing math is going to be a time that they're understanding math at a deeper level. As we know as adults, like, sharing ideas is how we're able to come up and collaborate and make our schools such amazing places. So it only makes sense that we translate that practice into our classrooms. All right, guys, well, without further ado, let's dig into those standards. We are, again, going to be talking about numerical reasoning, specifically fraction equivalence, comparison of fractions, and addition and subtraction of fractions with like denominators. This should sound familiar because that's also the umbrella of numerical reasoning we talked about in Module 5. So the big concepts and learning progression for numerical reasoning that we're going to be looking at today is numbers, which is decimal fractions, tenths, and hundredths, place value, fractions with denominators of 10 or 100, comparison, decimal fractions to hundredths place. So those are the major standards we're going to be talking about today. So go ahead and pause the video, look at the learning progressions from 3rd grade to 5th grade, maybe even take a minute to dig into what our current standards are, which are NF5 and NF7. That's where our focus is going to be today. So for this standard, which is NR5, there are 3 expectations. For each of those expectations, you are going to have examples, which is hugely helpful because for some of our expectations, we don't have specific examples, but for these 3, we do. So within those expectations, the evidence of student learning, they do a very good job of giving us fundamentals, so things that the student should already know for beginning. So that gives you a good idea of like prerequisites that you think the student should know. And it also gives you some really great strategies and methods. One of the big things that I want to note is that throughout this standard, it talks about using concrete models. So this isn't a rote memorization of what's greater or what's smaller. Students are allowed and are expected to use models to prove their thinking, which is just going to deepen their understanding of the standard. For NR5, solve real-life word problems involving addition, equivalence, comparison of fractions with denominators of 10 and 100, and comparison of decimal numbers as tenths and hundredths using part-whole strategies and visual models. This is kind of going to be our NF5, NF7 standards that we currently use and teach. They are modified a bit. It's actually kind of condensed down, and there's a huge emphasis on students using those concrete models and being able to prove their reasoning and thinking. You'll kind of notice that that's the case throughout the new standards, is that the expectation is students should be able to prove their thinking and justify it. Numerical reasoning to expectation 1, students are expected to fluently add and subtract multi-digit whole numbers to solve practical mathematical problems, use place value understanding and properties of operations and relationships between those operations. The word practical is very specific and lets us know that we need to connect these types of problems to real life situations. Note that the standard algorithm is not included in the emphasis, and the emphasis is now shifted to understanding place value in order to add and subtract. NR5-1 is demonstrate and explain the concept of equivalent fractions with denominators of 10 and 100 using concrete materials and visual models. Add two fractions with denominators of 10 and 100. And if you're like me, this is probably the standard that you've either most recently taught or getting ready to teach. This is our current NF5. But again, the emphasis on this is students using concrete materials and visual models. They are going to have to be able to do that in order to prove their thinking. This example came directly from the standards document. I really like it because it gives the specific visual model that they're kind of talking about that students need to use to support their reasoning. It is a base 10 model, so you can see that there's a hundreds flat and a tens frame. That's something that at this point of the year that students will be very familiar with, so it'll be something that they can even further make a deeper connection to these tenths and hundredths, but also to place value, which will then also help them connect better to decimals. So when they can see how all these numbers work together, it's just going to develop a deeper understanding of the content. NR5-2, represent, read, and write fractions with denominators of 10 or 100 using decimal notation and decimal numbers to the hundredths place as fractions using concrete materials and drawings. Again, that concrete materials and drawings. You are going to notice through all three of these expectations those are the words, that's the key for students to get that understanding of it. And it's also building that foundation for the skills that they're going to be learning in 5th grade. So this example for NR5-2 also came from the standards document. It's talking about Eric and him overpaying a medical bill by 62 cents. And it wants to know what fraction will the doctor's office refund? And you want students to reason that 62 cents is equal to 62 hundredths because they're going to make the connection that there are 100 pennies in a dollar. Not only is that going to build on prior knowledge, kids love talking about money, but also it's going to help them develop a deeper understanding. One of the big things that was like a light bulb moment for me was the connection of 50 cent being a half of a dollar. 50 cent is 50 hundredths. Students can make the connection that that equals 1/2. So it also kind of goes to those fraction equivalencies. So by using strategies like this, you're able to not only hit or review multiple standards and expectations, but it's giving students that knowledge, that schema in their head that they can go back to and refer back to later when they're solving problems. One of the big things about this expectation was it talked about authentic problems. So, for example, overpaying a medical bill is a problem that a student could possibly have. Hopefully not, but it's something that's going to be applicable to real life. It could also be paying for a field trip, going on a trip. Things like that are good ways to make this authentic. And using money is definitely a great way to make it authentic because, again, kids love talking about money. So this is actually the last expectation for this standard. So there are only 3 expectations for NR5. And this is compared two decimal numbers to the hundredths place by reasoning about their size. Record the results of comparisons with the symbols greater than, equal to, or less than, and justify the conclusions. So again, with this standard, you hear that word justified. Justify your thinking. You want students to be able to explain and show how they got their answer. So those tools are going to be concrete materials like drawings or number lines. So if you scan the QR code, it's going to take you to the IXL website. This could be a really great resource for whole group or small group instruction. It gives you problems, but then it also is going to have different ways to solve the problems at the bottom. Super easy to use. It's aligned to our current standards, so I hope that as we move forward with our new standards, it's going to kind of adjust its instruction. But I really like that it gives you those different ways to model comparing decimals, such as base 10 models and number lines. So students can have that physical, visual model. You can also purchase a membership, but there are a ton of resources on this available that are completely free. So I highly encourage you just to explore the free part of the website. It is super cool. It's very interactive. You can pull it up on your smart board, which I like. It would even work for like a problem of the day, like in the morning or in the afternoons, or like a bell ringer for students. But again, I really, really, really like it for this particular expectation because it has those visual models that they're wanting students to use to prove their answers. Here are some links to the Georgia DOE resources, Learning Progressions, Summary of Changes, and the K-8 standards. If you haven't explored these, I highly encourage you do so. It's going to help you develop a deeper understanding of these changes and the new standards. So here are a few resources that you might find helpful. The first is the IXL website that I talked about at the beginning. It's going to take you to the 4th grade page, and it pretty much has any concept that you might teach with example problems on it that you can pull from and utilize. The second is Money Pieces, and it actually is money, but it's embedded on top of base 10 blocks. That can be particularly helpful for all 3 expectations. It'll help students make the connection from tenths and hundredths fractionally, but also through decimals. I hope you find these resources helpful. And if you have any questions, as always, please reach out and let me know. So major takeaways from today. Base 10 frames are an awesome way to teach decimals and fractions of tenths and hundredths. Students need authentic activities to make those connections and retain the information. Money is one great authentic way for students to make connections to fractions and decimals. Today, the question you're going to be asked is, at the end of the module, would you please create a sample test question covering one of the reviewed expectations? Please also include a resource that you would use to teach the expectation. And I'm going to add one more part to it, not to make it seem too daunting, but ask one question that you have at this point about the new standards. It doesn't just have to be about these expectations or this standard. It can be about any of the ones before. And as always, if you need anything at all, if you have anything you would like to share, any ideas you have, or any major questions that you have, please, 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 please reach out to me. My email is in the presentation. So please just feel free to reach out so that we can collaborate and get together. I truly believe that the only way we're going to get through learning these new standards is if there's like open lines of communication. And I by no means am an expert. I'm learning with you guys as well. So I feel like if we all put in the effort and work together, we're going to come out the other side a whole lot more successful.